This episode of The Trail Went Cold is brought to you by Murder Book, a new true crime podcast hosted by best-selling author Michael Connelly, available on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Also be sure to check out Dark Sacred Night, Michael Connelly's latest #1 bestseller featuring detectives Harry Bosch and Renee Ballard. Thank you, and enjoy the show. October 12th, 2000. Houston, Texas. After leaving her home, 48-year-old Mary Henderson Morris does not show up for work, and her body is discovered inside her burned-out car on a remote road later that afternoon. 4 days later, another Houston woman, 39-year-old Mary McGinnis Morris, is discovered shot to death inside her car under eerily similar circumstances, but other than their name, there doesn't appear to be any connection between the two victims. However, the investigation uncovers potential suspects in Mary McGinnis Morris's murder, including her husband and a hostile co-worker, leading to speculation that Mary Henderson Morris's murder may have been a botched contract hit in which she was the victim of mistaken identity. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to be covering a very bizarre and infamous story involving the murders of two victims with the same first and last name, Mary Henderson Morris and Mary McGinnis Morris. The case is more commonly referred to as the Mary Morris murders, as both these women happened to live in Houston and were murdered within 3 days of each other under similar circumstances. Now, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the movie The Terminator, in which the title character is sent from the future to present-day Los Angeles to murder a woman named Sarah Connor. Since the Terminator does not have any idea what she looks like or where she lives, he proceeds to murder two other completely innocent women in Los Angeles named Sarah Connor, so the police initially assumed that the crimes were the work of some psycho who randomly selected the names of his victims from the phone book. Well, this particular case is the closest you'll find to a real-life example of that scenario, though the motive for these murders might be a lot different. It's possible that the second Mary Morris was the intended target all along, and the first Mary Morris was a completely innocent victim of mistaken identity. Now, this case is fraught with controversy, and if you heard the Q&A episode I released back in December, you might recall me sharing a story about corresponding with one of the people who was considered a possible suspect. So I'm definitely going to address that later, as the online drama which has ensued from this case over the years is one of its strangest elements. Incidentally, since I'm going to be detailing a story involving two victims with the same name, in order to avoid confusion, I'll often be referring to Mary Henderson Morris as Mary H. and Mary McGinnis Morris as Mary M. Anyway, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or a review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the Mary Morris murders. Our story begins in Houston, Texas in 2000. Our first central figure is Mary Henderson Morris, a 48-year-old bank loan officer who lives on a ranch in Baytown, located in Harris County, just east of Houston. Mary is married to Jay Morris, her husband of 5 years, and has a grown daughter from a previous marriage named Marilyn Blaylock. At around 6 a.m. on the morning of October 12th, Mary said goodbye to Jay as she left for work at Chase Bank and drove away in her Chevy Lumina. Over the course of the day, Jay would call Mary's cell phone and leave numerous messages on her voicemail, but she never called him back. After not hearing from her, Jay finally decided to call Mary at the bank during the afternoon, but was surprised to learn from her supervisor that Mary had not shown up for work that morning and never even called in, which was very uncharacteristic of her. This made Jay very concerned, and when Mary did not arrive home by 5 p.m., he contacted the police to report her missing. But it wasn't long before Jay heard from a friend that a burned-out car had been found in a remote area near the interstate, only 3 miles east of his ranch. Jay immediately called his stepdaughter Marilyn, and they both traveled towards this location, only to find that police had blocked off the road. They were soon horrified to learn that Mary's burned-out Chevy Lumina had been discovered by an ATV rider in an isolated drainage area. The vehicle had been set on fire, and a body burned beyond recognition was in the front seat. It would be 3 days before the victim's tooth fragments were used to positively identify her as Mary Henderson Morris. Due to the condition of her body, investigators were unable to determine Mary's exact cause of death. At around 10:20 a.m. that morning, witnesses had called the fire department to report seeing smoke from the area the vehicle was found, but it was initially dismissed as someone burning leaves. The crime left everyone perplexed, as Mary was known for being an incredibly nice person who didn't have any enemies, and there was nothing in her background to provide any insight about why someone would want to murder her. Jay Morris was never considered a suspect, nor was Mary's ex-husband, as they maintained an amicable relationship. The location where the Chevy Lumina was found was also in the opposite direction of her ordinary route to the bank. Mary had told Jay that she was planning to stop at a nearby gas station to get fuel on her way to work, but even though the clerk did recall serving someone matching her description that morning, the station's surveillance footage from that time period had already been taped over before police had the opportunity to check it. While Mary's purse had been taken, her credit cards were never used, and even though her wedding ring was missing, the rest of her jewelry was left behind and melted down by the fire. It did not seem like robbery was the primary motive for the crime, and it was apparent that the perpetrator had gone the extra mile to destroy all physical evidence. Within 4 days, however, the investigation would take a very shocking turn. After Mary's funeral was held on October 16th, Marilyn Blaylock contacted the medical examiner's office to ask about retrieving her mother's jewelry. To her absolute shock, Marilyn was told that Mary Morris's body was still in the morgue, which initially caused her to fear that another body had been buried in her mother's grave. But believe it or not, it turned out they were actually referring to another murdered woman named Mary Morris. The victim in question was 39-year-old Mary McGinnis Morris, who lived with her husband of 17 years, Mike Morris, and their 16-year-old daughter, Katie. Mary was a nurse practitioner, and the Morris family had moved to Houston from West Virginia in 1998 after Mary got a job as medical director for Union Carbide, which put her in charge of several of their local medical clinics. On the afternoon of October 15th, Mary left the clinic in Clear Lake where she worked in her company car, a Dodge Intrepid, in order to run some errands. At 5:34 p.m., Mary called up a friend and former co-worker named Lori Gemmel from her cell phone. Earlier that day, Lori had visited Mary at the clinic to receive a flu shot, but Mary mentioned that she was now at a drugstore and that, quote, "there is someone here who is giving me the creeps." Regardless, Mary told Lori that she was planning to return to the clinic, log out of her computer system, and then head home. But only 13 minutes later at 5:47 p.m., Mary would use her cell phone to make a frantic phone call to 911. The actual contents of this 911 call have never been released publicly, but it's heavily implied that Mary was in the midst of being attacked at that time, and one of the detectives was quoted as saying, "Anybody that's ever heard that tape has just had their blood chilled listening to it." Mary never returned home, so her husband reported her missing to the police. The following morning, Mary would be discovered dead inside her Dodge Intrepid on West Little York Road at a remote location which was the opposite direction of her workplace. She had been beaten and shot once in the head. The passenger side door was open and had blood on it, and the car keys were outside the vehicle. The location happened to be around 25 miles from where Mary Henderson Morris was murdered 4 days earlier. The murders had enough similarities that investigators initially thought there had to be a connection, but other than having the same name and a bit of a resemblance to one another, particularly with their hairstyles, there didn't seem to be any discernible link between Mary Henderson Morris and Mary McGinnis Morris. Like the previous crime, the only item of Mary's which appeared to be missing was one of her rings, so robbery did not appear to be the motive. But this time, the murder weapon was left behind at the scene, and turned out to be a gun registered to her husband, Mike. It appeared that someone had made a failed attempt to make Mary's death look like a suicide, but she had torn clothing, bruise marks on her wrists, and there was also evidence she had been gagged. Mary's 911 call also supported the idea that she had been involved in a violent struggle with an unknown assailant, so the suicide theory was ruled out. Shortly after Mary Henderson Morris was murdered, the Houston Chronicle had received an anonymous phone call from someone who said, quote, "They got the wrong Mary Morris the first time," and shortly thereafter, Mary McGinnis Morris turned up dead. This created speculation that the perpetrator had specifically been targeting Mary M. and initially killed Mary H. by mistake, so the whole situation was the result of a botched contract hit. This also could have explained the absence of Mary H.'s wedding ring from her murder scene, as some people theorized that the killer took it as evidence to show the person who hired them that the job was completed. The key difference between the two cases was that unlike Mary H.'s murder, there were at least 2 potential suspects who might have had a motive to kill Mary M. The first person to pop up on the radar as a suspect was a former co-worker of Mary's named Dwayne Young. Months before the murder, Dwayne had been hired as a temp to work as a nurse at Mary's clinic, but he did not get along with Mary at all, as he would often question her authority and complain about her to her superiors. According to Mike Morris, Mary became concerned enough that she asked if he would provide her with a gun she could carry for her protection. After Mike gave his wife a gun and showed her how to use it, she asked him to place it under the driver's seat of her car, and incidentally, this same gun would eventually be used to murder her. On October 12th, 3 days before she was killed, Mary stopped by her office and discovered that someone had been messing with her desk, rearranging items, and turning photographs around. Most distressingly, she then noticed that the words, "Death to her," had been written on a calendar on Dwayne's desk. When Mary informed her superiors, they advised her to stay home the following day. When Dwayne arrived at the clinic that day to make sure his time card was signed, he was told not to return and made a scene before he was escorted out. It's also worth noting that during her phone call with Lori Gemmel on the day she was killed, Mary mentioned that she thought she might have recognized the person from the drugstore who was giving her the creeps, and believed she may have met him through Dwayne Young. In spite of the problems between Mary and Dwayne, he had been to her home for a party, and she once attended a party he had thrown, so she did have the opportunity to make mutual acquaintances. However, no other information has ever been released about this person Mary mentioned. While they've never gone into specifics, investigators have stated that they may have evidence to link Dwayne to the crime, which is why they still consider him to be a suspect. Well, the second major suspect was Mary's husband, Mike Morris. The couple had been having problems with their marriage prior to the murder, which stemmed from many things, including Mike's frustration about being unable to find work since they moved to Houston. Mike also became distrustful when he started hearing rumors that Mary was having an affair with a family friend and reportedly followed his wife on numerous occasions. But according to Mike, he confronted Mary and this friend, and they both denied the affair. Mary's sister, Stephanie Lohr, would claim that Mary once told her that she had fallen in love with someone else, but did not want to leave her husband, and was willing to make the marriage work. Mike first popped up on the radar as a potential suspect when it was discovered that he had taken out a substantial life insurance policy on his wife, and, depending on which source you read, he stood to collect between $500,000 and $700,000 from her death. Mike refused to allow himself or his daughter Katie to be questioned by the police without an attorney, and he also turned down the request to take a polygraph, though he claimed this was because he was on antidepressants and anti-anxiety medication, which he feared might skew the results. In his defense, Mike did have an alibi, as he was out at the movies with Katie during the time period Mary was murdered. But the one piece of evidence which implicated Mike, and could not be overlooked by investigators, was a call which showed up on Mary's cell phone bill. At 7:11 p.m., nearly an hour and a half after Mary was recorded making her frantic phone call to 911, Mike used his own cell phone to call Mary's cell, and according to records, the call lasted 4 minutes. Mike did admit that this call took place, but claimed that Mary's phone simply rang for 4 straight minutes without an answer before he hung up. However, investigators did not buy this story, as the phone company insisted that this call should not have shown up on Mary's cell phone bill unless the call had been completed. There were other odd details which seemed to implicate Mike. The doors to Mary's vehicle automatically locked whenever she put the car into gear, but since the passenger side door was found wide open, this created speculation that the killer may have had access to the car. And remember how one of Mary's rings went missing after she was murdered? Months later, a friend of the family was having dinner with Mike and Katie and noticed that Katie was wearing Mary's missing ring. Mike's response was that Katie had found it and that Mary must not have been wearing it when she was killed, but even though Mike had been the one who told investigators the ring was missing, he never contacted them to let them know it had been found, and they only learned about this from the family friend. While he is still considered by police to be a suspect, there was no direct evidence to prove that Mike was involved in his wife's murder. He eventually moved back to West Virginia with his daughter and continued to maintain his innocence. There would be a couple more odd developments in Mary Henderson Morris's case. 6 months after she was murdered, Jay Morris received a bill for $2,000 on Mary's phone card, which had been inside her missing purse at the time she was killed. The charges were eventually traced to a 16-year-old girl in Galveston who claimed she had found the phone card inside a purse in the parking lot of a local convenience store in March of 2001. This girl gave the purse to a neighbor who threw out all its other contents, but both these people were ruled out as having any involvement in the murder. But curiously, when the purse was returned to Mary's family, they claimed it did not belong to her and was not the same purse she was carrying on the day she was killed. Around the same time period, Jay started receiving phone calls at his unlisted number from an unidentified male asking for Mary. Jay did not tell the caller that Mary was dead, but the third time he called, Jay provided the phone number of one of the detectives on the case and said he could reach Mary there. The caller replied, "Oh yeah, right," before hanging up, and he never called again. While these calls were traced to an apartment in Baytown, the lead ultimately went nowhere. The case received national exposure on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries in 2002, as well as episodes of America's Most Wanted, Good Morning America, and The Montel Williams Show. Doing media appearances together has allowed the two victims' surviving family members, in particular Mary H's daughter Marilyn Blaylock and Mary M's sister Stephanie Lohr, to bond together and become close friends. But believe it or not, investigators have since started leaning towards the theory that the two murders might not actually be connected after all. In particular, they've expressed skepticism with the mistaken hit theory, as one detective was quoted as saying, "Unless you had a totally bumbling hitman that just went by and said, 'I will just look for the first Mary Morris I can,' I don't see that as a viable option." Since there were over 300 murders in Harris County in the year 2000, the police cannot rule out the possibility that two women with the same name could have been killed during the same week, and the whole thing was nothing more than a coincidence. Whatever the motive for these crimes was, the Mary Morris murders both continue to remain unsolved. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. But before we continue, we would like to send out a special thanks to Murder Book, the new true crime podcast hosted by best-selling author Michael Connolly, who has published 32 novels and sold over 74 million books worldwide. Returning to his roots as a journalist, Michael Connolly is now presenting his own true crime podcast and working with the very detectives who inform his novels and his hit television show Botched. Murder Book explores real homicide cases not covered by the mainstream media, and Season 1 is titled The Telltale Bullet, as it dives into a 30-year-old Hollywood carjacking gone wrong, which tests the limits of the American criminal justice system. Murder Book features actual wiretaps, witness interviews, court recordings, and detective recollections to piece together this true crime podcast. And we would also like to recommend Dark Sacred Night, the latest #1 bestseller from Michael Connelly, whom I've been a big fan of for many years, ever since I read another #1 bestseller of his, The Lincoln Lawyer. Dark Sacred Night features one of his most iconic characters, Harry Bosch, teaming up for the first time with Detective Renee Ballard, the protagonist of Mr. Connelly's previous novel, The Late Show. The two characters work together to investigate the unsolved murder of a 15-year-old female runaway. Dark Sacred Night measures up to the high standards of the author's previous works, as Connelly is a master storyteller who always presents strong, well-defined characters and displays his vast knowledge of police procedurals. The Washington Post calls Dark Sacred Night darkly brilliant, ingenious, and frantically suspenseful, and you can find it wherever books are sold. I'm also greatly looking forward to the Murder Book podcast, particularly due to its promise to explore lesser-known cases, as it will be interesting to learn about some real-life crime stories which influence Mr. Connelly's fictional stories. So be sure to check out Michael Connelly's new Murder Book podcast, which is available on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts, or you can go directly to the website murderbookpodcast.com. That's murderbookpodcast.com. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the episode. Okay, so before I explore this case any further, I have to address the online drama that wound up ensuing from it. As you probably know, I am a frequent poster at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum, which I've referenced on virtually every episode of this podcast, and it's not uncommon for people who are associated with cases from the show to post there. If you visit the forum, you'll find a number of locked discussion threads from around 2005 containing a ton of posts by someone under the username Koala, who just happens to be Mary McGinnis Morris's former co-worker, Dwayne Young. Well, all this stuff took place many years before I joined the board, so I was not there to personally witness this, but long story short, a number of people closely associated with Mary M., including her sister Stephanie, her daughter Katie, and her friend Lori Gemmel, wound up joining the discussion threads, and there were a number of heated exchanges with Koala. And things got so bad that one of the detectives on the case actually contacted the board's administrator and requested that he lock all threads and bring a halt to all discussion about the Mary Morris murders because it was interfering with an active investigation. So for years, there was a ban on talking about the case on the board, but it's since been lifted, and you'll find an extensive new discussion thread which was started in 2015. Now, I'm not going to repeat any of the information that Koala or any other parties posted in that thread, because there were some pretty serious accusations against people who have never been named as suspects by law enforcement, and I have no idea if any of these accusations are true. But I will say that the highlight was when Koala made a post where he offered a $50,000 reward for a conviction in the case and wrote, quote, "The stipulation is that the conviction must not result in my arrest or conviction, but someone else." End quote. Well, I guess that's a reasonable stipulation. Anyway, in 2011, I received an email from Koala, aka Dwayne Young, not because of anything to do with the message board, but because I had written a column on my blog about my favorite unsolved mystery segments, and it included the Mary Morris murders. I will say that our exchanges were very cordial, but Dwayne is quite a unique individual, to say the least. I don't know if this still holds true today, but there was a time where whenever anything remotely connected to the Mary Morris murders showed up online, Dwayne would find a way to interject himself. He has always maintained that he is completely innocent of both these murders, and claims that all of the stories about his creepy behavior towards Mary McGinnis Morris have been completely exaggerated. I have no idea if that's true, but I'll share my thoughts about Dwayne as a suspect a little later. Anyway, I know people often make Terminator and Sarah Connor references when discussing this story, but I honestly cannot think of another real-life example of something like this happening where two people with the same name in the same city are murdered within a short time of each other. One thing I've always wondered is if there were any other women named Mary Morris living in Houston at that time, because if so, this whole situation must have been pretty terrifying for them, since for all anyone knew, These murders could have been the work of some psycho randomly targeting people with the same name. On the surface, the most logical explanation for this whole thing is that the perpetrator's primary goal was to murder Mary McGinnis Morris, but wound up murdering Mary Henderson Morris by mistake. But this is one of those theories that starts falling apart the more you think about it. But let's start off by discussing the murder of Mary Henderson Morris, aka Mary H. One of the main reasons many people believe in the mistaken identity theory is that there just didn't seem to be anyone in Mary H's life who had a motive to kill her. Her husband was never a suspect, her ex-husband was never a suspect and still had a decent relationship with her, and she just sounded like an all-around great person who had no enemies. I mean, it would be one thing if this was a random crime, or if Mary was the victim of a robbery, but someone went to the trouble of completely torching her vehicle and her body to destroy all physical evidence, which is not something that your average run-of-the-mill criminal is going to do. They did such a thorough job that investigators could not even figure out what actually caused Mary H's death, so we don't know if she was beaten or shot in the head like Mary M was. It was also impossible to determine if she was sexually assaulted, so we have no idea if that could have been a potential motive either. Another issue is that we don't even know the exact time Mary H was killed or where she might have crossed paths with her killer. We know she left her house at 6 a.m., and witnesses recalled seeing smoke at around 10:20 from the location her burnt-out vehicle was eventually found, so she was definitely killed during that time frame. While it cannot be conclusively established that she was there, Mary did have plans to stop off at a nearby gas station, so someone could have easily abducted her at that point. Mary's Chevy Lumina was found 3 miles in the opposite direction of her route to work, but she could have been killed at another location, and the perpetrator subsequently took the vehicle and her body to that spot because it was very remote and an ideal place to set the car ablaze and cover their tracks. Like I mentioned earlier, robbery did not seem like the motive for this crime, since most of Mary's jewelry was left behind, and the only thing missing was her purse and wedding ring. Now, a lot has been made about the wedding ring, and it's led to speculation that the murder was committed by a contract killer who took the ring as proof to show the person who hired them that the job had been completed. Well, this is the type of scenario you'll often find in works of fiction, but it really doesn't make a lot of sense here. If the killer had completely disposed of the victim's body and ensured it would never be found, then yes, an item like a wedding ring might need to function as evidence that the victim is dead. But Mary and her vehicle were set on fire next to a public road, so sooner or later, she was going to be found. A murder like that is definitely going to make the news, which I'm pretty sure is all the proof anyone would need that the job was completed, so taking the wedding ring sounds pretty pointless. Another odd element of Mary's murder, which doesn't get discussed as much, is her phone card, which was used by a teenage girl who found it inside a purse in a parking lot in Galveston, which is about 50 miles from Houston. It would be one thing if the phone card was inside Mary's purse, and the killer had just dumped it in that parking lot to get rid of it. But Mary's family swore that this particular purse did not belong to her, meaning that someone made a concerted effort to remove the phone card from her original purse, put it inside a completely different purse, and dispose of it in an entirely different city. This may have been done as an attempt at misdirection to throw off the investigation and lead them outside of Houston. And if that's the case, it pretty much worked, since police had to spend time chasing down a teenage girl who had no involvement in the murder. In addition, there were also the phone calls made to Jay Morris asking for Mary 6 months after her murder, which were especially weird since his number was unlisted. These calls may not have any relevance to the case, but they also could have been another attempt at misdirection. Even though Mary's phone card was tracked down, as far as I can tell, her original purse, credit cards, and wedding ring are still unaccounted for. So does this mean Mary Henderson Morris was killed because she was mistaken for Mary McGinnis Morris? Well, there are a few pieces of evidence which do seem to suggest this, as I otherwise can't figure out why anyone would want the first Mary Morris dead, and would go to the trouble of completely torching her car and her body. But the more I think about it, the more I cannot imagine how this mistaken hitman scenario would have played out. There are 2 potential suspects in the murder of Mary McGinnis Morris, Dwayne Young and her husband, Mike Morris. These are both people who would have known all the key details of Mary's life, such as where she lived, where she worked, and what type of car she drove. If they hired a hitman, they presumably would have shared all this information with them, so I just don't see how things could have gotten so crossed up that the hitman wound up murdering a completely different woman with the same name. Well, the two Marys had some physical similarities. Look at all the major differences. Mary H. drove a Chevy Impala. Mary M. drove a Dodge Intrepid. Mary H. lived on a ranch in Baytown, while Mary M. lived on the opposite side of Houston, 25 miles away. Unless the only instructions provided to the killer were, kill a woman from Houston named Mary Morris, look up her address in the phone book, I just don't see how they could have messed this up so badly. I know criminals are often really stupid, but this practically crosses the line into too stupid to be true territory. To put this into perspective, I've covered a couple of other cases on this podcast where a person was murdered execution style, and it was suspected that they were a victim of mistaken identity because a professional hitman killed the wrong person. As an example, there's the murder of Doug Johnston, who was shot in the back of the head after parking his car at his workplace in what resembled a contract hit. Since Johnston was an ordinary family man who had nothing in his background to make him a probable target for murder, it's been suspected that he was mistaken for Don Devereaux, a journalist who was investigating government corruption and lived directly across the street from the computer graphics company where Johnston worked. Now, in this situation, it's easy to see how the wrong person might have gotten killed. Johnston and Devereaux both drove similar-looking cars, and there was only a one-digit difference in the addresses of the computer graphics company and Devereaux's house. It's possible that neither the killer nor the person who hired him knew Devereaux personally, so if Johnston was shot from behind in a dark parking lot, the killer may not have even seen his face. Since the murder is still unsolved, we don't know for certain if it really was a mistaken contract hit, but it's not implausible that could have happened. However, both Mary Morrises lived at entirely different locations, drove different cars, and Mary H. was attacked in broad daylight, so if her murder was a mistake, there must have been a serious miscommunication. I guess an alternate explanation is that perhaps it was the perpetrator's plan all along. Their primary goal was to kill Mary McGinnis Morris, but when they discovered that there was another person living in the Houston area with the same name, they staked out Mary Henderson Morris's ranch, followed her when she left for work one morning, murdered her at the first available opportunity, and then proceeded to torch the evidence. They might have hoped that when Mary M. turned up dead days later, the police would be so focused on finding possible connections to the first Mary Morris that they'd automatically assume both women were murdered by some random psycho and overlook anyone who had a legitimate motive to want Mary M. dead. Like I mentioned in the intro, when the first two Sarah Connors wind up dead in The Terminator, the police initially suspect that a lunatic just picked out their names at random in the phone book. There are times when I wonder if this really was the case here, and that some psycho with no connection to either woman just decided to look up the names of two people from the Houston area named Mary Morris and murdered them both for kicks. However, the main problem with that theory is that investigators believe that Mary M's murder was a failed attempt to make her death look like suicide, so it seems like whoever killed her did not want people to think her case was connected to Mary H's murder. So who would have wanted Mary McGinnis Morris dead? Well, let's start with Dwayne Young. He adamantly denies many of the claims made about his harassment of Mary at the clinic, and maintains that he did not rearrange the items in her office or write the words death to her on his desk calendar. I find it interesting that Mary M. discovered all that stuff on the evening of October 12th, several hours after Mary H. was murdered, but in a way, that effectively debunks the idea that Dwayne could have hired a hitman who murdered the wrong Mary Morris. As you recall, this was pretty much the final straw for Dwayne's employment at the clinic, as he was fired the following day, and since Mary M. was killed 2 days after that, I can see why it's easy to assume this gave Dwayne a motive to murder her. But then how would Mary H's murder fit into this? I know Dwayne and Mary M. had a hostile relationship, but Mary H. was killed before Dwayne got fired, so would he really have had that much of a hatred towards Mary M. that he would have hired someone to murder her? If that's what happened, It seems pretty brazen for Dwayne to have messed around in Mary M's office after Mary H. was killed. And while I'm sure it's tempting to believe Dwayne's online behavior and obsession with this case makes him look guilty, I actually think it favors his innocence. Like I mentioned earlier, there was a time when this guy popped up to interject himself every time this case was ever mentioned online. And would you do that if you were a suspect in a murder you actually committed? Compare that to Mike Morris, who has pretty much gone out of his way to stay out of the spotlight and eventually moved out of the state after he was named as a suspect. In Dwayne's defense, while Mike has always been reluctant to be questioned by police, it seems like Dwayne has always been cooperative. One reason I have my doubts that Dwayne personally murdered Mary M. is because she made 2 phone calls shortly before her death, and from what I can tell, she never made any mention of them. During Mary's final call with Lori Gemmell, she talked about seeing someone at a drugstore who, quote-unquote, gave her the creeps, but it definitely wasn't Dwayne, though she wondered if it was someone she had met through Dwayne. I have no idea if this person was ever identified or investigated, but it's possible the entire call was just a red herring, and that Mary simply saw a person who made her uncomfortable, but had no involvement in her murder. While the contents of Mary's frantic 911 call have never been released publicly, I can only assume that if Dwayne had been the person attacking her while this was going on, she would have said something during the call. I guess it's possible that Dwayne could have hired someone to kill Mary, but his grudge against her seemed very personal, and I found it more likely that someone with that much hatred would want to commit the murder themselves. So while Dwayne Young is definitely a strange individual, I am inclined to think that he had no involvement in either of these murders. But on the other hand, Mike Morris seems to fit the perfect stereotype of someone who would orchestrate a murder like this. We have a troubled marriage in which a jealous husband had accused his wife of having an affair and was supposedly following her at times. He was also frustrated from being unemployed for an extended period of time, and he stood to collect on a life insurance policy for hundreds of thousands of dollars if his wife died. If the motive was financial rather than personal, then it would definitely make more sense to hire someone to murder your wife, especially since Mike had an alibi placing himself at the movies with his daughter at the time Mary was killed. Now, Unsolved Mysteries featured its fair share of interviews with husbands who were suspected of murdering their spouse, but Mike is one of the only ones who was accused of orchestrating the murder rather than doing it themselves. Some of the stuff police said to paint Mike as suspicious, such as his unwillingness to take a polygraph test or be questioned without an attorney, really doesn't mean all that much to me, as even innocent people are advised not to talk to the police without a lawyer and to completely avoid polygraphs in general. I know his daughter Katie was seen wearing Mary's missing ring in the months after her murder, and while Mike's story that they simply found it does sound a bit suspicious, especially when you consider the circumstances of how the other Mary Morris's wedding ring went missing, I guess it's not completely implausible. However, the one red flag which is pretty difficult to overlook is Mary's cell phone bill, which shows that Mike made a 4-minute call to Mary's phone 2 hours after she made a frantic phone call to 911, so it's very likely that she was already dead by the time this call took place. Now, I should mention that while I'm assuming that Mary had voicemail on her cell phone, I can't 100% confirm it. Remember, this was the year 2000, and voicemail was not yet an automatic feature on every phone. If she didn't have voicemail, Mike's explanation about letting her phone ring for 4 straight minutes could have conceivably happened, but if she did have voicemail, then that makes 0 sense. Now, if you watch the Unsolved Mysteries segment, or go to the profile page for this case on the Unsolved Mysteries website, you can actually see Mary's cell phone bill, which has a record of her phone call to Lori Gemmell at 5:34 p.m. and her subsequent call to 911 at 5:47. The rest of the calls after that are listed as incoming. The first one took place at 5:50, which I'm assuming is 911 making an attempt to phone Mary back after her call to them cut off, and the next one listed is Mike's call to her phone at 7:11 p.m. What's interesting is that all of these incoming calls have the number 2 listed next to them, but Mike's call is the only one which has the number 4, which is the amount of minutes he claims he was on the line. If Mary had voicemail, then I'm guessing that 2 is just the number they automatically list if a call goes to voicemail and is not picked up. Mary had no less than 7 incoming calls listed on her bill after Mike's call, and I have my doubts that all of them were from callers who let the phone ring for 2 straight minutes before they hung up. The detective who was interviewed during the Unsolved Mystery segment heavily implies that the phone company had told him that Mike's call at 7-Eleven was a completed call, and that if he had simply let the phone ring for 4 minutes before hanging up, it never would have shown up on the bill to begin with. Regardless, it's still pretty hard to believe that Mike would have stayed on the line for 4 minutes while Mary's phone rang. For those of you who are old enough to have lived in the pre-voicemail answering machine era, can you recall a time when you phoned someone and let the phone ring 4 straight minutes before you hung up? Generally, if the phone rings that long, that's a pretty clear indication that the person isn't going to answer. I guess you might wait that long if you were seriously worried about that person, but at this point, Mike had been at the movies with his daughter and presumably had not yet learned about Mary's 911 call or that her life was potentially in danger. So there really is no reason for him to stay on the line for 4 minutes waiting for her to answer. Though, given that Mike was a jealous husband and had recently accused Mary of having an affair, one explanation which might make sense is that he assumed she was with another man at this point and was hoping that causing her phone to ring for 4 minutes might compel her to answer. But this whole situation brings up another important question. If Mike hired someone to murder his wife and called them to make sure the job was done, why would he do so on Mary's cell phone? Again, that sounds like another one of those too stupid to be true situations. Even if Mike was not the most technologically sound person, he still should have known that any time you make a phone call, there will be a record of it. If this hitman needed to communicate with Mike, why couldn't they have carried their own cell phone? Well, if Mike did call his wife's killer, I actually have a theory about why he would have done so on Mary's phone. Remember how police said they believed the scene was staged in such a way to make it look like Mary had committed suicide? Theoretically, let's just say that Mike hired a contract killer to murder his wife, but he killed the wrong Mary Morris by mistake. Mike now knows that if another woman from Houston named Mary Morris turns up murdered, it's going to raise some major eyebrows, so he decides that the only way to kill her and avoid suspicion would be to make her death look like a suicide. According to Mike, Mary asked her to give him a gun to carry as potential protection against Wayne Young and had him place it underneath the seat of her car. So it does seem like quite a coincidence that Mary would be murdered inside her car with that very same gun a short time later. Mary's car also locked automatically, which is presumably how she had enough time to call 911 before she was killed. When she was found, the windows were not broken, the passenger side door was open, and the keys were outside the vehicle. This suggests that the killer was able to access the vehicle while Mary was inside, and the easiest way this could have been done is if someone provided them with an extra set of keys to unlock the door. And the most likely person who could have done that was her husband. The killer then attacks Mary and shoots her in the head with her own gun and tries to stage the whole thing as a suicide. Remember, we really only have Mike's word that he placed his gun underneath the seat in Mary's car. For all we know, that could have been a lie, and he gave this gun to the killer beforehand. Now, while this murder takes place, Mike is at the movies with his daughter and has an airtight alibi, but afterward, he places a call to Mary's cell phone and speaks with the killer to confirm the job was done. If Mike was planning to make Mary's death look like a suicide, he probably did know that this call to her phone would show up on the record, but he plans to explain the call away by sharing a sob story about how Mary told him she was going to kill herself and Mike tried to talk her out of it, but was unable to stop her. The problem with this idea? Before she was killed, Mary managed to make a call to 911 in which she was clearly fearful of her life, and she put up a big enough struggle that the killer left bruises on her wrists. So once it became abundantly clear to the police that Mary was murdered, there's no way Mike's story about trying to talk his wife out of suicide is going to hold water. And unfortunately for him, he now has a call to Mary's cell phone on the record, which took place over an hour after she was killed, and the only excuse he can come up with to explain this is, the phone rang for 4 straight minutes. If Mike really did phone Mary's killer, then this is the best explanation I can come up with for why he would do something so careless. On the surface, there really does appear to be a compelling amount of evidence to suggest that Mike Morris hired a hitman to kill his wife, who murdered the wrong Mary Morris the first time around, before killing the correct one a few days later. But there are a few things I just can't get around. Mike's call was made about an hour and a half after Mary was presumably killed, and since her cell phone was found near her body, why would her killer still be hanging around the murder scene after all that time talking on Mary's phone? But most importantly, if you hired someone to murder your very own wife, how in God's name could they manage to kill the wrong person? You can provide every single detail about your spouse's personal life to the killer to ensure the crime is carried out as efficiently as possible, so I honestly don't know how things would reach the point where a completely different woman with the same name gets killed instead. Much like the murder of Mary Henderson Morris, one of the problems with figuring out what happened to Mary McGinnis Morris is that we don't know the exact location where Mary M. crossed paths with her killer. We know she made her call to Lori Gemmel from a drugstore and told her she was heading back to her clinic, but the remote location where she was found was in the exact opposite direction of her workplace. So did the killer enter her vehicle and force her to drive there? We know Mike was at the movies at this point, presumably to establish an alibi, so it is odd that he would choose this point to have a hitman perform the murder, since I'm not sure he could have known Mary would leave the clinic to go run some errands. Now, this fact was shared by Mike's daughter Katie in a post she made on the Unsolved Mysteries message board in 2005, but Mike apparently did not collect on Mary's life insurance policy. If the deceased was the victim of an unsolved murder, and the beneficiary is publicly named as one of the prime suspects, it certainly makes sense that the insurance company wouldn't want to pay out. But on the other hand, some life insurance policies do not pay out in the event of a suicide, so if Mike's motive for the crime was financial gain, then trying to make Mary's death look like a suicide wouldn't have been in his best interest. I should mention that Katie has made it clear in her Unsolved Mysteries message board posts that she believed her father was innocent. It's definitely a horrible situation for her to experience the murder of her mother and her father be accused of orchestrating the whole thing, so for her sake, I do hope that Mike genuinely had nothing to do with it. But the one thing which is really hard to overlook is the phone call. I guess it's theoretically possible that Mike's 4-minute call on Mary's bill could have been a mistake by the phone company, and I might be more inclined to write it off as a glitch if Mike had initially said the call went straight to voicemail. But Mike flat out admitted that he let the phone ring for 4 straight minutes, which just doesn't sound believable to me and comes across as a guy who's lying and decided this is the best explanation I can come up with. I am really curious to know why the police eventually started leaning towards the idea that the two crimes aren't actually connected, and it's just an odd coincidence that 2 women from the same city named Mary Morris were murdered within 3 days of each other. I mean, it's certainly not impossible, but I just can't get over the circumstances of how Mary Henderson McGinnis was found. Why would someone commit a seemingly motiveless crime by murdering a well-liked woman with nothing suspicious in her background before torching all the evidence? It has all the earmarks of a professional hit, but why target her? I have to think that Mary H's death is connected to Mary M's somehow. One more chilling thought a lot of people have had is that if the perpetrator had been hired by Mike Morris to kill his wife, and they murdered the wrong Mary Morris by mistake, the killer may have wanted to tell Mary H that her husband set the whole thing up, so Mary H went to her grave believing that her own completely innocent husband orchestrated her murder. I seriously hope that is not the case. While this situation might not be as cut and dried as a contract killer mistakenly murdering the wrong woman, something has to link these 2 crimes together. One last thing I haven't talked about is the phone call to the Houston Chronicle after Mary H's death, in which an anonymous male stated they got the wrong Mary Morris. Remember, this took place before Mary M was murdered, and if the caller was involved, I'm not sure why they would do this. So I have to wonder if this was an intentional attempt at misdirection. I still think that the most logical explanation is that Mike Morris orchestrated this whole thing, but I can't help but think there's still a big piece of the puzzle missing here. A throwaway detail which is mentioned in one of the articles about this case, but has never been expanded upon, is the claim from Mary M's sister, Stephanie Lore, that Mary had once told her she was in love with someone else, but still wanted to save her marriage with Mike. So who is this other person Mary was in love with? Was this the friend that Mike accused Mary of having an affair with? We know Mary expressed some feelings about this person, but it's not clear whether they actually crossed the line into having an affair. This might be an insignificant detail, but it's still interesting to ponder. This case is just a real head-scratcher, and I can't come up with a concrete theory to account for everything. But the ironic thing is that if the first Mary Morris's death was a mistake, that's a pretty colossal blunder, yet the perpetrator has still managed to get away with it for nearly 2 decades. So if you happen to have any information on the murders of Mary Henderson Morris or Mary McGinnis Morris, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email at robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you have a moment, please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We've already produced some exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, and we recently released an episode about another case which was featured as a final appeal segment on Unsolved Mysteries, the controversial conviction of Larry Race for the murder of his wife, Debbie Race. So to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I'd also like to take a moment to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon these past few weeks, and they are Michael H., Paige B., Barb W., BJJ, Catherine S., Fern E., and Lucia D. Thank you all so much for your support. I also just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit and the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum, where, like I mentioned, there are a lot of interesting threads about this case, many of which contain posts from the actual people involved. So if you feel like checking it out, prepare yourself for a major rabbit hole. I need to provide a big thanks to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, or Spotify. So have yourself a good week, and join me next Wednesday for a brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.